Welcome to the Playing Books podcast.
Great to be here.
Today, we're tackling a story probably everyone listening thinks they know inside out. David and Goliath.
Ah, yes, the classic underdog tale. The little guy against the giant.
Exactly. We picture this young shepherd, maybe with a slingshot, achieving this, impossible miracle against a huge, terrifying warrior. It's like the ultimate story of faith and courage beating the odds.
It is. But what if that picture, the one we all hold, what if it's fundamentally wrong?
Wrong how?
Well, what if the odds weren't what we thought? What if the miracle wasn't quite so miraculous? That's the core idea we're exploring today based on the fascinating book David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell.
Okay, so this episode is all about unpacking Gladwell's take on this.
Yeah.
He argues, doesn't he, that we consistently misunderstand strength and weakness.
That's precisely it. We look at things like size, wealth, resources, and we just assume, okay, that's the advantage. That guarantees success.
But Gladwell flips that completely.
He really does. He argues that those very things we see as strengths can actually be crippling weaknesses. And conversely, what looks like a disadvantage, lacking resources, struggling, being small, can actually unlock hidden strengths, maybe even give you the winning edge.
So the big question for this podcast episode is, how? How can being a giant loaded with resources actually hold you back?
And how can being the underdog, the one facing the struggle, give you the kind of flexibility or, the perspective you need to win?
It's a counterintuitive idea, but let's dive right in, starting where Gladwell does, in the Valley of Elah, nearly 3,000 years ago.
Right. So the Philistines and the Israelites are at war. They agree to settle it with single combat. Enter Goliath.
And he's not just big. He's equipped for a very specific kind of fight, isn't he?
Totally. He's the definition of heavy infantry. Gladwell paints this picture. Over 100 pounds of bronze armor. Helmet, body armor, shin guards.
Wow, 100 pounds.
Yeah, plus a heavy shield, a javelin, a massive spear, a sword. He's basically a walking tank.
And he expects a particular kind of battle.
Exactly. He expects another heavy infantryman to come out, stand toe-to-toe, and they'll just duke it out. Close quarters combat, like those famous duels in ancient history. Roman heroes versus Gaul warriors, that kind of thing.
His entire setup, all that armor, is for that fight.
Optimized for it. But that expectation, that reliance on his perceived strength, that's his first huge mistake.
Because David arrives and he immediately breaks the rules. King Saul offers him armor, right? His own royal gear.
He does. He offers his tunic, his bronze helmet, his sword, the standard kit.
And David's response is famous. I cannot walk in these, for I am unused to it.
Boom. That's the first critical moment. David refuses to play Goliath's game. He chooses speed, agility, maneuverability over being weighed down.
Goliath is literally burdened by his own advantage.
Perfectly put. David steps out as an irregular. He's not bound by the conventions of single combat. He's free to fight differently.
And then there's Goliath's size itself. Gladwell digs into this, suggesting his incredible height, 6'9" or maybe even taller?
Yeah, the text says 6 cubits in a span, which is huge. At least 6'9", possibly much more depending on the cubit used.
That very size might have been his biggest weakness. Gladwell presents evidence that Goliath might have suffered from acromegaly.
Right, acromegaly. It's a condition usually caused by a tumor on the pituitary gland. It leads to excessive growth hormone.
Which explains the giant size, maybe the prominent features often described.
Exactly. But the crucial part, the potential hidden weakness, is a common side effect of acromegaly.
Which is?
Vision problems. Often severe vision problems, like restricted peripheral vision or even diplopia double vision.
Double vision. Okay, how does that connect to the story?
Well, think about the details in the text. Goliath has an attendant walking ahead of him, carrying his massive shield. Why does a champion warrior need someone to guide him onto the battlefield?
I always just assumed the shield was too heavy or something.
Maybe, but Gladwell suggests the attendant wasn't just a shield bearer. He was likely a visual guide. Goliath might not have been able to see clearly where he was going. His world could have been blurry, doubled.
And there's that line, when David approaches.
Yes, it's fascinating. Goliath sees David coming with his shepherd's staff and shouts, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?"
Sticks, plural.
Plural. But David was only carrying one staff.
Whoa.
It's a tiny detail, but Gladwell argues it's a huge clue. It strongly suggests Goliath was suffering from double vision. He literally saw 2 staffs.
So he's insulted, maybe partly because he can't even properly perceive his opponent or the threat. He's blinded by his condition, by his size.
And trapped by his expectations. He's ready for a close-quarters fight with another heavily armed soldier, and instead, he gets...
David, who has zero intention of fighting that way.
None at all. Because David isn't infantry. He's a projectile warrior. He's a slinger.
Okay, break that down. Ancient armies had different types of soldiers.
Right. You had your cavalry, your heavy infantry like Goliath, and then you had projectile specialists, archers, and slingers. Basically the artillery of the ancient world.
And slingers.
Yeah.
Probably underestimate how dangerous they were.
Hugely. Especially against slow-moving, heavily armored targets like Goliath. A skilled slinger, someone who grew up defending flocks from predators, could be incredibly accurate and deadly.
How deadly are we talking? What kind of weapon is a sling, really?
We're talking about a smooth, dense river stone, maybe the size of an egg. An expert could whirl it around maybe 6-7 times a second before releasing it.
That sounds fast.
It is. And when you apply the physics, the ballistics, Gladwell cites research, including input from the Israeli Defense Forces.
And what did they find?
They calculated that a stone from David's sling would have hit Goliath's forehead, the one vulnerable spot not covered by armor, at about 34 meters per second.
Okay, 34 meters per second. How fast is that, really?
Think about it like this. The impact velocity is comparable to a bullet fired from a fair-sized modern handgun.
Seriously. A stone from a sling hits like a bullet.
In terms of velocity and focused kinetic energy, yes. It's more than enough force to fracture the skull, penetrate the brain, instant knockout, or death.
So Goliath, lumbering forward, maybe seeing double, expecting a wrestling match.
He never stood a chance. David took him down from a distance, exploiting his immobility and impaired vision. Goliath was geared up for the wrong fight entirely.
So the miracle was actually a tactical masterpiece. The giant's perceived strength, his size, his armor became his fatal weakness.
Exactly. Immobility, poor vision. And David's perceived weakness, just a shepherd with a sling, was actually a high-tech, high-velocity weapon perfectly suited for the situation.
It completely reframes the story.
It does. And Gladwell uses this to introduce a broader concept, citing political scientist Ivan Eregwin-Toft's research on warfare.
What did Eregwin-Toft find?
He studied thousands of conflicts between strong and weak sides over the last 200 years. When the weaker side fights conventionally, trying to match the strong side's tactics.
They usually lose, right? That fits our underdog narrative.
They do. They win only about 28.5% of the time, which sounds like long odds, like a miracle is needed.
Yeah.
But if the weaker side refuses to play by the giant's rules, if they use unconventional tactics, guerrilla warfare, insurgency, like David using a sling instead of a sword,
What happens then?
their winning percentage skyrockets. It jumps to 63.6%.
Wow, nearly 2/3 of the time.
Yeah. The underdog actually wins more often than not when they change the game, when they don't fight on the giant's terms. David versus Goliath wasn't an exception. It was an example of a winning strategy.
So the lesson is, don't fight the giant's fight. Use your disadvantage as freedom to do something unexpected.
That's the core tactical insight. And it leads perfectly into the next big idea Gladwell explores, the paradoxical downsides of having advantages. He uses this concept called the inverted U curve.
Okay, the inverted U curve. What is that, basically?
It's a visual idea shaped like an upside-down U. It suggests that for many things we think are purely good, having more is better only up to a certain point.
Like a sweet spot.
Exactly. There's an optimal middle ground. Before that point, more is good. But after that point, having even more of that same thing stops being helpful and can actually start making things worse. The curve goes down.
More isn't always better. Sometimes more is worse.
Precisely. More money, more resources, maybe even, as we'll see, smaller class sizes. It's not a straight lineup. It curves back down. Pursuing the maximum advantage can actually limit you.
Gladwell gives a really striking modern example of this, right? The basketball coach.
Oh yeah, Vivek Ranadive. This is a fantastic story. He's a Silicon Valley software guy originally from India, knows basically nothing about American basketball.
And he gets roped into coaching his daughter's junior basketball team.
Right, his 12-year-old daughter on Jolly's team.
Right.
And the team is, well, let's just say they weren't destined for greatness.
How bad were they?
He described them as mostly little blonde girls, daughters of Silicon Valley engineers. They couldn't shoot, they couldn't dribble reliably, they weren't particularly tall or athletic. Their disadvantage was just a profound lack of skill.
So, a classic underdog situation. What does Ranadive do?
He realizes that playing traditional basketball, running set plays, trying to outshoot the other teams, would be suicide. They'd get destroyed every single game. He saw conventional basketball as like a conspiracy favoring skilled teams.
So he needed an unconventional strategy, like David.
Exactly like David. He decides they won't play traditional basketball at all. Instead, he institutes a relentless, non-stop, full-court press.
Defending the entire court all
Yeah.
the time, even in junior girls basketball.
All 94 feet, all game long. It was completely unheard of. The idea wasn't to showcase skill because they didn't have any. The idea was pure effort and disruption.
How did that even work?
The goal was to harass the other team constantly, especially when they were trying to inbound the ball. There's a 5-second rule to get the ball in play. Renadiva figured if his team just swarmed the ball handler relentlessly, they could force turnovers before the other team even crossed half court.
So it's about creating chaos and forcing errors, not about making baskets themselves?
Precisely. It was exhausting, high risk, but it did something crucial. It completely hit his team's weaknesses. They didn't need to shoot well or run complex plays if the other team couldn't even get the ball up the court cleanly.
And they'd get easy points off steals.
Exactly. Easy layups from turnovers.
Mm.
It substituted effort and attitude for traditional basketball skill. Ranadiva called it using their legs, not arms.
And did it work?
Amazingly, yes. This team of unskilled girls started winning and winning. They made it all the way to the national championships.
No way, just by pressing.
Just by pressing relentlessly. It drove the other coaches crazy. They complained it wasn't real basketball, that it was cheap or unsportsmanlike.
Because Ranadivi wasn't playing by the Giants' rules.
He wasn't. He was an outsider, an immigrant who didn't grow up with American basketball culture. He didn't have those ingrained assumptions about how the game should be played. That lack of conventional wisdom gave him the freedom to try something radical that exploited his team's only possible path to victory, sheer effort, and unconventional tactics.
It's a perfect example of leveraging disadvantage, their lack of skill, force them into radical innovation.
Absolutely. And this idea that what looks like an advantage might not be, or might even be a disadvantage, applies in so many areas. Gladwell uses the example of class sizes in schools.
Right, the class size paradox. This one feels really counterintuitive. Everyone thinks smaller classes are better, right? Parents demand it, politicians promise it.
Seems obvious. More teacher attention per student, quieter classrooms. What's not to like? Government spent billions, literally tens of billions, between the mid-90s and early 2000s trying to reduce class sizes based on this belief.
So did it work? Did test scores go up?
Largely no. When researchers looked at the data across many countries, the results were really disappointing. Gladwell highlights a study looking at 18 countries. Significant benefits were only found in 2 places, Greece and Iceland. In most places, including the U.S., the massive investment didn't produce much academic improvement, especially when classes went from, say, the mid-20s down to around 18.
Why not? That seems like a decent drop.
It's that inverted U-curve again. In that middle range, it seems teachers often don't fundamentally change how they teach just because there are a few fewer kids. Their workload might decrease slightly, but the actual pedagogy, the interaction, doesn't necessarily improve enough to boost learning significantly. The benefit plateaus.
Okay, so smaller isn't automatically better in the middle range, but Gladwell takes it further, doesn't he? He argues too small can be actively bad.
Yes, that's where the U-curve really dips. He tells the story of Teresa DeBrito, a principal worried about her classes at Sheppog Valley Middle School becoming too small.
Why would that be a problem? Isn't maximum individual attention the goal?
Her concern, backed by research like Jesse Levin's, was about losing critical mass. You need enough peers in a classroom for robust discussion, for diverse viewpoints, for energy.
Especially for kids who are struggling.
Exactly. Levin's work suggests struggling students benefit from seeing other students grapple with the same material. It normalizes the difficulty, provides peer support, creates more opportunities for different explanations to emerge.
So if a class is too small, too intimate,
It can actually feel isolating, especially if you're the one having trouble. The lack of peer interaction, the lack of intellectual friction can stifle learning. The supposed advantage of intimacy becomes the disadvantage of insufficient peer dynamics.
so the ideal isn't the smallest possible class, but maybe somewhere in that optimal middle range of the curve.
Seems like it. And this same curve appears again when Gladwell looks at wealth and parenting.
Ah, the wealth paradox. Obviously, poverty is incredibly stressful and makes parenting harder.
No question. Money relieves basic stress, provides opportunities, but the research suggests that benefit also follows an inverted U. More money helps well-being and effective parenting up to a certain point.
What point is that, roughly?
Studies often put it around $75,000 a year in household income, though the exact number varies.
Huh.
Up to there, more money generally correlates with better outcomes.
But after $75,000?
The positive impact levels off pretty dramatically. More money beyond that doesn't seem to buy significantly more happiness or make people dramatically better parents.
Okay, so it plateaus. But does it go down? Does extreme wealth make parenting harder?
Gladwell argues strongly that yes, it does. At the very high end of the wealth spectrum, the curve dips again. Having immense resources becomes a significant parenting challenge.
How so?
He uses the story of a Hollywood mogul, someone who grew up in extreme poverty, working in his father's brutal scrap metal business. He calls himself an immigrant to wealth.
Meaning he wasn't born into it, he earned it through struggle.
Right. He knew scarcity, he learned ambition, the value of hard work, responsibility. He had to pay for half his first bike, that kind of thing. Scarcity was his motivator.
But his kids.
His kids, as Gladwell puts it, live courtside. They grow up with immense privilege, never experiencing that fundamental need to strive to overcome scarcity.
And that lack of struggle is the problem.
It creates a huge parenting dilemma. Yeah. When you have virtually unlimited resources, you lose the easy excuse. Sorry, we can't afford that.
Right, you can always afford it.
So you're forced to shift to a much harder, much more demanding justification. No, we won't buy that for you.
Which requires having really clear, articulated values.
Exactly. You have to explain why not, based on principles, not finances. And that's incredibly difficult. Many wealthy parents struggle with this transition. They end up giving their kids everything, removing all obstacles, all need for effort.
And the result can be kids who lack ambition, resilience, maybe even self-worth, because they've never had to earn anything or overcome anything real.
That's the danger Gladwell points to. The very advantaged limitless wealth removes the necessary ingredients of struggle and scarcity that often forge strong character. The advantage becomes a profound disadvantage for the next generation.
It's the dark side of the silver spoon, which connects to another idea, how we judge ourselves based on who's around us, the big fish, little pond effect.
Yes, this is about relative deprivation. The core idea is that our sense of satisfaction or achievement isn't based on some absolute scale, but on how we compare ourselves to the people immediately around us, our local pond.
Gladwell mentions a study from World War II.
Right. Soldiers in the Army Air Corps, which was highly selective and had high promotion rates, were actually more frustrated about promotions than soldiers in the military police, where promotions were much rarer.
That makes no sense. The Air Corps guys were getting promoted more often.
But they weren't comparing themselves to the Army average. They were comparing themselves to the other high flyers in the Air Corps around them, many of whom had already been promoted. They felt deprived relative to their immediate peers. They were little fish in a very big pond.
Well, the military police guys compared themselves to other MPs, most of whom also hadn't been promoted, so they felt okay. Big fish in a smaller pond.
Exactly. And this has huge implications for education, particularly college choice. Gladwell tells the story of Caroline Sachs.
What was her situation?
She was a bright student, got into both Brown University, an elite Ivy League school, and the University of Maryland, a very good state school.
She chose Brown, right, for the prestige.
She did. The big pond. But once she got there, she found herself surrounded by academic superstars. In her science classes, she was probably in the bottom third of the class.
Even though she was objectively very smart.
Objectively smart, yes. But relative to her Brown peers, she felt average, or even below average. She said she felt dumber.
And that feeling affected her choices.
Profoundly. That feeling of relative incompetence eroded her confidence and her motivation to stick with challenging science subjects like organic chemistry. She ended up switching out of a STEM major.
Even though she likely had the raw ability.
Very likely. And Gladwell presents damning statistics on this. He points out that students in the bottom third of the science class at Harvard drop out of STEM majors at roughly the same rate as students at much less selective schools, like Hartwick College.
Wow. So being at Harvard didn't protect them if they felt like they were at the bottom?
Not in terms of persistence in science. But here's the kicker. A student who is a top performer at Hartwick, a big fish in that smaller pond, is statistically more likely to graduate with a STEM degree than a student with the exact same academic ability who ends up in the bottom third at Harvard.
So being the big fish, even in a less prestigious pond, actually increases your chances of succeeding in a tough field.
The data strongly suggests yes. Feeling competent, feeling like you belong and can succeed relative to your peers is a huge factor in motivation and persistence, especially in difficult subjects like science and math.
So the perceived advantage of going to the absolute best school can backfire if it puts you in a position where you constantly feel inadequate.
It can be a major disadvantage, crushing your academic self-concept. It really forces you, the listener, to think. What environment truly helps you thrive? The one that impresses others but might demoralize you, or the one where you feel capable and motivated, even if it's not the top-ranked place?
That choice, and the realization that struggle isn't always bad, leads us right into Gladwell's next major theme, the theory of desirable difficulty.
Right. This is sort of the flip side of the inverted U-curve. Developed by psychologists Robert and Elizabeth Bjork, it argues that certain kinds of difficulties, obstacles, or even impairments aren't just things to be overcome. They can actually be beneficial. They can force us to develop compensatory skills that make us stronger in the long run.
Difficulty can be desirable. That sounds wrong.
It sounds counterintuitive, for sure. But Gladwell presents some really compelling examples. One of the most striking is the connection between dyslexia and entrepreneurship.
Dyslexia, the reading disorder, how can that be an advantage?
Well, it's a serious challenge, no doubt. But Gladwell points out that a surprisingly high percentage, maybe as much as a third of highly successful entrepreneurs, are dyslexic. People like Richard Branson, Charles Schwab, David Neeleman, founder of JetBlue.
Okay, that is surprising. So did they succeed despite the dyslexia?
Or, Gladwell asks, did they succeed in part because of it? The idea here is compensation learning. The struggle forced them to develop other skills to an extraordinary degree.
Like what kind of skills?
Take David Boies, the super famous trial lawyer. He's severely dyslexic. He reads very slowly, struggles with dense legal texts.
How can you be a top lawyer if you can't read quickly?
You compensate. Boies developed phenomenal listening skills. He trained himself to absorb and retain vast amounts of information just by hearing it in meetings, depositions, court.
A skill that's maybe more useful in a live courtroom than speed reading.
Arguably, yes, especially during cross-examination, where catching subtle shifts in testimony is crucial. He also had to learn to simplify incredibly complex legal arguments down to their absolute essence so that he could understand and remember them.
Which naturally makes those arguments easier for judges and juries to understand, too.
Exactly. His struggle forced a communication style that turned out to be a huge advantage in his profession. The desirable difficulty of dyslexia spurred the development of superior alternative skills.
That's compensation learning. What about other ways disadvantage helps? Gladwell mentions Gary Cohn, the former Goldman Sachs executive.
Right. Cohn also struggled immensely with dyslexia. Kicked out of schools, took him hours to read short assignments. He felt like an outsider his whole life.
And that struggle gave him something else.
Gladwell argues it gave him what he calls disagreeableness. Not being mean, but being willing to buck convention, to challenge norms, to take risks that more agreeable people, those who fit in and follow the rules, wouldn't dare take.
Why would being an outsider make you more disagreeable in that sense?
Because if you've constantly struggled and been told you're not good enough, maybe you feel you have less to lose by breaking the rules. You're less invested in conforming to a system that hasn't worked for you.
And Cohn definitely broke the rules, didn't he? About getting his first Wall Street job.
It's legendary. He basically bluffs his way into an interview. He shares a cab to the airport with a senior partner from a brokerage firm, pretends he knows all about options trading, which he didn't, and impresses the guy enough to get hired on the spot.
An agreeable person would never try that. Too much risk of being caught, of embarrassment.
Exactly. But Cohn's history of struggle, his desperation, his outsider status, gave him the audacity, the disagreeableness to pull it off. That willingness to operate outside conventional boundaries was fueled by his disadvantage.
So disadvantage can breed compensatory skills and a kind of useful defiance. What about resilience? Gladwell talks about the London Blitz.
Ah, yes, the idea of acquired courage. During World War II, the British government was terrified that the German bombing campaign against London would cause mass panic, societal collapse.
But it didn't, did it? Londoners became famous for their resilience.
They did.
Yeah.
And a Canadian psychiatrist working in Britain at the time, J.T. McCurdy, developed a theory about why. He said a bombing raid psychologically divides people into three groups.
Okay, what are the groups?
There are the direct hits, those killed or seriously injured, obviously traumatic. Then there are the near misses, those who were close to the blast, deeply traumatized, often paralyzed by fear afterwards.
And the third group?
The remote misses. These are the people who experienced the bombing, maybe heard the explosions, feared for their lives, but ultimately emerged physically unscathed.
They expected the worst, but it didn't happen to them.
Exactly. And McCurdy argued something fascinating happens to this group. He wrote that the conquering of fear produces exhilaration. Surviving the danger you dreaded creates this profound sense of relief and confidence. It inoculates you against future fear.
So surviving the trauma actually made them braver.
It seems so. McCurdy said this newfound confidence becomes the very father and mother of courage. They faced death and walked away, making them psychologically tougher, more resilient for the next raid. They acquired courage through surviving the ordeal.
That's a powerful idea. Gladwell connects this even to childhood trauma, right? Which feels like a really sensitive area.
It is, and he's careful here. He's absolutely not saying childhood trauma is good, but he points to studies showing a surprisingly high correlation between losing a parent at a young age and achieving great eminence later in life.
Like the statistic about British prime ministers.
Yeah, something like 2/3 of British PMs between the 19th and mid-20th centuries had lost a parent before age 16. Again, the point isn't that orphanhood is desirable, but that enduring such a profound direct hit early on and surviving it can fundamentally change a person.
How so?
It can shatter your assumptions about safety and the predictability of the world. When you face the absolute worst and are still standing, it can forge an incredible resilience, maybe a willingness to take risks or challenge conventions because, well, what's left to fear?
He uses the example of Dr. Emil Freireich, the cancer researcher.
Yes, Jay Freireich. His childhood was marked by extreme poverty, instability, the early death of his father, just brutal circumstances.
And he brought that experience into his work fighting childhood leukemia.
He did. He was working at the National Cancer Institute in the 1950s and 60s when acute lymphoblastic leukemia in children was basically a death sentence, 100% fatal, usually within weeks or months.
A hopeless situation.
Totally hopeless. And Freireich started proposing radical treatments, specifically combining multiple highly toxic chemotherapy drugs at once.
Which sounded crazy at the time.
It sounded insane.
Yeah.
These drugs were poisons designed to kill cells. The standard practice was to use one at a time, very cautiously. Combining 4 potent toxins seemed reckless, unethical. His colleagues, his superiors, they were horrified.
But Freireich pushed ahead. Why?
Gladwell argues it was partly because of his background. He had endured worse. He had faced down despair and chaos in his own life. He had that disagreeableness, that willingness to defy authority and conventional wisdom, born from his own hard-won survival. He wasn't intimidated by the establishment telling him no.
He had the courage to try the unthinkable because the status quo was already unthinkable, certain death for those kids.
Precisely. He ignored the protocols, mixed the drug cocktails himself sometimes, persisted through terrible side effects and institutional resistance, and eventually developed the VMP regimen.
Which was the breakthrough.
The first successful combination chemotherapy. It started pushing cure rates up dramatically. Today, thanks to the foundation he laid, cure rates for that type of leukemia are over 90%.
Wow. So his capacity to endure struggle, his defiance born from trauma, was essential to saving countless lives.
It seems undeniable. His desirable difficulties forged the character needed for that monumental breakthrough. It's a powerful illustration that the skills and courage gained through hardship are often inaccessible to those who live lives of ease.
Which brings us full circle, in a way, back to strategy and how the supposedly weak can outmaneuver the strong. This leads into Gladwell's final section on the limits of power and the trickster hero.
Right. If the giant is weighed down by advantages and expectations, the underdog can use that predictability against them. The trickster figure, think Brer Rabbit in folklore, or Loki in mythology, wins not through strength, but through cunning and exploiting the opponent's weaknesses.
And Gladwell applies this to the civil rights movement.
He does, specifically to Wyatt Walker, Martin Luther King Jr.'s chief strategist during the crucial campaign in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, Project C.
They were facing Bull Connor, the notoriously racist and brutal commissioner of public safety. He was the Goliath in this situation.
Absolutely. Powerful, entrenched, willing to use extreme force. King and Walker knew they needed to provoke a crisis, something that would capture national attention and force the federal government to intervene. Peaceful protests alone weren't enough. They were being ignored or suppressed.
So Walker needed Connor to overreact.
Exactly. Walker, the trickster, needed to manipulate Connor, the giant, into revealing his brutality on a national stage. They needed Connor to tip his hand. They knew Connor, like Goliath, suffered from arrogance and a crude understanding of power. He wouldn't distinguish between peaceful protesters and threats. He'd just use overwhelming force.
Which is why they made the controversial decision to use children in the marches.
Yes, the famous Children's Crusade, D-Day and Double D-Day. Walker knew images of children being attacked would be far more shocking and galvanizing than images of adults. He wasn't hoping Connor would let them march peacefully. He was counting on Connor not letting them.
He wanted the dogs and the fire hoses.
He absolutely wanted them. He knew those images. Police dogs biting nonviolent teenagers, high-pressure hoses ripping clothes off young people would horrify the nation and the world.
And Connor obliged. He walked right into the trap.
He did exactly what the trickster needed him to do. His reliance on brute force, his inability to see the strategic trap, turned his power against him. The dogs and hoses became the movement's most powerful weapons, forcing President Kennedy's hand.
So overwhelming power used illegitimately backfires,
Wow.
which connects to another concept Gladwell discusses, the principle of legitimacy.
Yes, this is crucial for understanding why brute force often fails. He uses the example of the British Army's experience in Northern Ireland during the Troubles.
They went in with a certain theory of power.
They did, influenced by thinkers like Lates and Wolfe, who basically saw power as a math equation. If you want people to comply, you just need to make the cost of not complying high enough. Punish disorder severely, and people will choose order. It required, in their view, neither sympathy nor mysticism, just cold, hard calculation.
Sounds logical, in a grim way. How did it work out in Belfast?
Catastrophically, because it ignored the principle of legitimacy. This principle says that people obey authority not just because they fear punishment, but because they believe the authority is fundamentally fair and just.
The rules have to feel legitimate.
Exactly. The authority needs to be predictable, its rules need to make sense, and people need to feel like they have a voice, that they'll be heard.
And the British Army in Northern Ireland violated this.
Massively, according to Gladwell's sources. They conducted sweeping, often arbitrary house searches in Catholic neighborhoods, sometimes hitting the same families over and over. They used excessive force, acted disrespectfully, failed to distinguish between civilians and militants. They gassed a priest during one incident.
Actions that would destroy any sense of fairness or legitimacy.
Completely. And the result wasn't submission, it was outrage and defiance. Instead of crushing the insurgency, the Army's heavy-handed, illegitimate tactics alienated the entire Catholic community and created more recruits for the IRA.
Gladwell quotes Rosemary Lawler, whose brother got involved after their family experienced harassment.
Right. She said something powerful like, "I wasn't born this way, this was forced upon me." The illegitimate use of power radicalized people who might otherwise have remained on the sidelines. Power without legitimacy breeds resistance, not compliance.
We see a similar dynamic maybe in the story of California's three strikes law.
Absolutely. Gladwell contrasts two responses to horrific tragedy. Mike Reynolds, whose daughter Kimber was tragically murdered, channeled his grief into pushing for the three strikes law.
The idea being much harsher, longer sentences for repeat offenders would deter crime and keep dangerous people locked up. More punishment equals less crime.
That was the theory. More power, more control through incarceration. It feels intuitive, especially when you're grieving and angry.
But does the evidence support it? Does punishment follow that simple more is better logic?
Again, no. Criminological research strongly suggests punishment follows an inverted U-curve. Up to a point, punishment deters. But beyond that point, increasingly harsh sentences have diminishing returns on deterrence.
Why is that?
Well, many crimes aren't committed after careful calculation. They happen impulsively, under the influence, out of desperation. The threat of 25 years versus 15 years might not register in that moment. And crucially, mass incarceration itself starts to cause harm. Sociologist Todd Clear's research is key here. He found that when incarceration rates in a neighborhood go above a certain threshold, maybe around 2% of the adult population, the collateral damage starts to outweigh any benefit.
What kind of collateral damage?
You're removing parents, workers, positive role models. You're destabilizing families, concentrating poverty, creating cycles of trauma and resentment. Paradoxically, locking up too many people can actually cause crime rates to increase in the long run.
And three strikes led to massive increases in incarceration in California, right? For relatively minor third offenses sometimes.
Exactly. People getting 25 to life for things like stealing pizza or shoplifting videotapes. Gladwell argues it created conditions akin to those high-crime, destabilized neighborhoods. Clear studied the overwhelming power of the law applied broadly and perhaps without nuance became counterproductive.
Reynolds sought more power to fight crime, but it arguably backfired. Gladwell contrasts him with Wilma Dirksen.
Yes, another parent whose daughter, Candace, was murdered. But Dirksen, rooted in her Mennonite faith tradition, a group historically familiar with persecution and the limits of worldly power, chose a different path.
Not vengeance or maximum punishment.
No. She and her husband chose forgiveness, understanding, and focusing on their own healing and family, rather than investing all their hope in the state's power to punish. They recognized the futility and potential destructiveness of seeking absolute retribution through the legal system.
They saw the limits of that kind of power.
They did. They walked away from demanding the full force of the law, finding strength not in power, but perhaps in accepting its limitations.
It's a profound contrast, which leads to the final powerful example in the book, Le Chambon.
Ah, the village in France.
Yeah.
Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. During World War II, this small village, populated mostly by Huguenots, descendants of persecuted French Protestants, managed to save thousands of Jews from the Nazis and the collaborationist Vichy regime.
How did they do it? Weren't they risking everything?
They were, but Gladwell argues they were uniquely equipped for this defiance because of their history. The Huguenots had endured centuries of persecution themselves. They were, in a sense, a community of remote misses many times over.
They had inherited a culture of resistance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They had learned the arts of evasion, quiet defiance, and principled disobedience over generations. They knew how to resist illegitimate authority because their ancestors had been doing it for centuries. Fear didn't paralyze them in the same way.
So when the Vichy officials or the Nazis came demanding they turn over Jews or sign loyalty oaths,
They simply refused, calmly, quietly, but absolutely. The pastor, André Trucmé, and his congregation saw it as their Christian duty. When Trucmé and his assistant pastor were arrested and pressured to sign an oath of allegiance, they refused because they wouldn't endorse the regime's actions against the Jews.
they had a kind of courage born from inherited disadvantage, from generations of being the underdog.
Precisely. The Nazis couldn't really intimidate a people who had already conquered their deepest fears about defying authority. Le Chambon's weakness, their history of persecution, became their greatest strength in that moment.
It ties everything together beautifully. The giants, Goliath, Bull Connor, unchecked wealth, overwhelming state power. They're often trapped by their own rules, their arrogance, their inflexibility.
While the underdogs, David, Ranadivé's team, Boy, Freyarich, the villagers of Le Chambon, find strength in their disadvantages. It forces compensation, breeds resilience, grants the freedom to be unconventional, disagreeable, and ultimately courageous.
This whole exploration through Gladwell's David and Goliath really challenges our basic assumptions, doesn't it? It's been fascinating. The core takeaway seems to be that power is never as absolute as it looks, and weakness is never as limiting if you're willing to change the rules of the game.
Absolutely. The book fundamentally asks you listening to re-examine your own life, to look at your struggles, your perceived failures, your limitations, not just as obstacles, but as potential sources of hidden strength.
It's a powerful reframe. So the final thought we want to leave you with, drawn from Gladwell's work, is this. What disadvantage in your own experience, maybe it's a lack of money, a skill you feel you lack, a past hardship, even a diagnosis like dyslexia, what if that's actually a desirable difficulty?
What if that very struggle has equipped you with unique skills, a different perspective, or a kind of resilience that the conventionally successful Goliaths around you simply don't possess and could never anticipate?
It's definitely something to think about long after this episode ends. The practical lessons in strategy, parenting, education, and just personal resilience in David and Goliath are incredibly thought-provoking.
They really are. We genuinely hope this discussion has maybe sparked some new insights for you, maybe helped you see your own challenges, past or present, in a different light.
If these ideas resonated, we strongly encourage you to grab a copy of the book, David and Goliath, by Malcolm Gladwell. Read the stories, dig into the research yourself. It's a truly worthwhile read.
And consider engaging with the author, Malcolm Gladwell, on social media if you're interested in his ongoing work and thoughts on these kinds of topics. He often explores similar themes in his other writing and podcasts.
Definitely check it out. Thank you so much for joining us on the Playing Books podcast for this deep dive into David and Goliath.
We hope you found it valuable.
Please follow or subscribe to the Playing Books podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend who might also find it interesting. We appreciate your support.
Thanks again for listening.
We'll catch you next time for another episode of the Playing Books podcast.